remember it like it was yesterday. His hands were all over me, warm, firm, and so impossibly intoxicating. I could feel the weight of his body pressing against mine. The rhythm of our breaths tangled together in the dim light of the room. The air was thick with desire, electric with the kind of passion that makes your skin tingle and your heart race faster than it should. Billy, the Navy pilot I had only just met, moved in closer, his lips brushing against my neck, and for that one moment I forgot everything. Who I was, what I had promised myself, and why I had resisted this kind of connection for so long. Billy's hands moved with an urgency that both excited and terrified me. His fingers grazed my skin, leaving a trail of fire in their wake as they slid down the curve of my back. Every touch, every breath we shared in that fleeting moment was charged with something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Raw, unfiltered passion. My fingers found his hair, pulling him closer as he pressed me against the wall, our bodies melting into each other. The dim light in the room flickered, casting shadows on the walls that seemed to dance in time with us. His lips moved from my neck to my collarbone, then lower, each kiss sending a shiver down my spine. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it so loud I was sure he could hear it. But I didn't care. I wanted more. The air between us grew heavier, and the world outside that room ceased to exist. It was just him and me, locked in a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. His grip tightened around my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. As his hand cupped my cheek, I met his gaze, and for the first time, I saw the vulnerability behind his confident exterior. We were both falling, surrendering to the moment, unable to stop. His mouth found mine, and our kiss was soft at first, tentative, but it quickly grew deeper, more demanding. Time seemed to slow as the connection between us ignited something primal. I couldn't think, couldn't speak. There was only feeling, and for the first time in so long, it felt like freedom. My name is Laura, and this is the story of how I ended up in a whirlwind romance that I never saw coming, and how it almost broke me. It all started when I was dragged to a Navy ball by my sister, Isabel. She needed a +1 since her husband had some last-minute work obligations. And being the good sister I was, I agreed. I didn't know that night would change everything. I wasn't expecting much from the event, just some stiff conversations, a few polite nods, and maybe a glass of wine or two to get through the evening. But then I met him, Billy. Tall, dark, and brooding, with this quiet intensity that pulled me in before I even realized it was happening. We didn't exactly hit it off right away. In fact, our first interaction involved me spilling red wine all over his date's pristine white dress. Classic me, always a bit clumsy, especially in moments that mattered. But instead of getting upset, he made a joke, and somehow, in that moment of awkwardness, a spark ignited between us. I felt it, and I could tell he did too. I spent the rest of the evening trying to avoid him though. He wasn't my type. A Navy pilot, I'd watched my mother struggle through my father's military career, always waiting, always worrying. I didn't want that for myself. But fate had other plans. Every time I turned around that night, there he was, watching me with those piercing blue eyes, making me feel things I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. By the end of the evening, he was the one who walked me to my room. and I was the one who let him in. There was something about him, something irresistible, something dangerous. I told myself it was just one night, a fling, nothing more. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I tried to push him out of my mind, but it was impossible. We kept running into each other, like the universe was determined to throw us together. I wasn't sure if I liked it or if it terrified me. Maybe a little bit of both. Isabel, ever the matchmaker, kept teasing me about him, but I brushed it off. I didn't want to get involved, not with a man like Billy. He had that hard edge, the kind of man who belonged to the Navy, not to a woman. And yet, every time we talked, every time he touched me, I felt myself falling deeper. It wasn't just the attraction, though God knows that was intense enough. It was the way he looked at me, like he saw right through my walls, through all the defenses I had built to protect myself from getting hurt. And it scared me, because I knew that once those walls come down, I'd be vulnerable, exposed. Then came the Tiger Cruise. My sister convinced me to join, and before I knew it, I was aboard the ship, with Billy right there, making it harder and harder to resist the pull between us. We spent hours together, talking, laughing, exploring the ship's history and unraveling old love stories from the archives. The more time we spent together, the more I realized how much I wanted him, not just physically, but emotionally. But I couldn't let myself give in. I had too much at stake. My heart, my future, everything. The tension between us reached a breaking point one evening, alone in the archives. I was reading an old journal about a love story from the Vietnam War, and suddenly, Billy was there, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body against mine. He reached out, gently tracing the outline of my hand as it rested on the pages, and I felt my breath hitch in my throat. "I can't stop thinking about you, Laura," he whispered, his voice rough with need. I should have stopped him. I should have pulled away, but I couldn't. Instead, I leaned in, closing the distance between us, and in that moment, everything else melted away. We kissed, and it was like the world stopped spinning. Nothing mattered except for the two of us, tangled up in each other, lost in a moment of pure, raw passion. Billy's touch was gentle at first, almost hesitant, but the tension between us made every movement feel like a spark about to catch fire. His fingers trailed up my arm, brushing lightly over my skin, and I felt my pulse quicken. I turned toward him, and the heat in his eyes made it clear that there was no turning back. He reached for me, his hand sliding around my waist, pulling me closer until our bodies were flush against each other. I could feel the strength of him, the need between us finally surfacing after all this time. Our breaths came in shallow bursts as the air in the small, dusty archive room seemed to thicken. Billy leaned in, his lips hovering over mine, teasing, waiting for permission. I didn't hesitate. I closed the distance, pressing my lips to his, and the tension that had been building between us erupted. His kiss was deep, full of unspoken promises, and the kind of desire that made my knees weak. I wrapped my arms around his neck, pulling him closer, feeling the heat of his skin through his shirt. He lifted me onto the desk, his hands roaming down my sides with an intensity that sent shockwaves through me. There was no space for second guessing, no room for doubt. My fingers traced the lines of his jaw as I kissed him again, slower this time, savoring the moment. It wasn't just about the physical, There was something more. The connection between us was undeniable, and as I looked into his eyes, I knew that no matter how much I had tried to resist, I was already his. But as the day went on, reality crept back in. I knew what I was doing was dangerous, not just for me, but for both of us. Billy's life was tied to the Navy, and I didn't want to become another woman waiting by the window, hoping her man would come home safe. I didn't want to be my mother, and yet, walking away from him felt impossible. Then, one night, everything came crashing down. We were in New York, tracking down the last piece of the love story we had been unraveling together, and I realized something. I wasn't just falling for Billy, I was already in love with him. That realization hit me like a freight train. I tried to pull back, to protect myself, but it was too late. I was in too deep, and the fear of losing him, of losing myself, was overwhelming. I don't know what happens next. Maybe Billy and I will find a way to make it work, despite all the odds stacked against us. Or maybe I'll have to let him go, to save myself from the heartbreak I've been trying to avoid for so long. All I know is that for the first time in a long time, I felt alive with him. And that's something I'm not ready to give up just yet.